for a few more people to join us. While we're waiting, it would be fantastic if you could introduce yourselves in the chat, and during the evening you're welcome to comment on what you're listening to. If there are any specific questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll be watching the chat, but if you don't put them into the Q&A, we won't be able to access them so easily. We've got 66 people with us at the moment, so we'll just wait a little bit for a few more people to join us. Okay, I think I'll get started, and anyone who's coming in a little bit later will have to catch up as they go along. Okay, so a massive thank you to everyone for joining us tonight for this, our very first landscape recovery test and trial webinar. It's not the first webinar that the Foundation for Common Land have done linked to tests and trials, and if you haven't joined us before, please have a look at our YouTube channel. You access through our website, and you can see the webinars that we've run before on our Common Land test and trial. And we have a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As I've said, please introduce yourself on the chat. It's really good to know who's joining us. And again, remember to add your questions to the Q&A, and if you see a question in the Q&A that you really like, you can upvote it, and then it'll push it up to the top of the list. And at the end of the webinar, we've left a reasonable amount of time to answer everyone's questions, and if you we will try and get round to everyone's questions, and if there are questions that we haven't answered but we think are really relevant, we'll find a way to get those out to everyone. We will be recording this webinar, and it will be available to view on our YouTube channel at a later date. I'm hoping that Susie will be able to pop a poll up now. If you could answer the poll, it's really useful for us to see who is joining us tonight, and for you as well. While the poll is running, it takes a little bit longer for people on phones, so we'll leave it up a little while. I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're doing tonight. So we're going to start this evening. In fact, I don't think I've introduced myself. My name is Lyndsey Stride, and I am project managing this test and trial for the Foundation for Common Land. I've been a trustee for the Foundation for many years, and just recently stepped up to this role. After I've finished, and we've finished the poll, I'm going to pass over to Julia Aglionby, who is our Chief Executive, and she will talk to you about where we are now with the test and trials, but also with policy on a more sort of national level, where we are with landscape recovery, where we are with local nature recovery. After that, Joseph Lieper, who is our facilitator for the test and trial in the Malvern Hills, he'll be talking to two land managers who are representing tonight the sort of the landowners on common land. So we've got Leanne Sargent, who is the ecologist for the Forestry England in the New Forest, and Jonathan Bills from the Malvern Hills Trust. After that, Joseph will talk a little bit about the work that we've done through this test and trial, the conversations we've had with landowners and land managers. After that, we will move on to Susan Mitchell in the New Forest, and Susan's our New Forest facilitator, and she will be talking to Jonathan Gorelli, Head Adjuster and Commoner in the New Forest, and Matt Gardner, Commoner in the Malvern Hills. After that, we will have our Q&A, and that's your chance to comment on what you've heard this evening, and hopefully we'll all have learned something tonight. Haven't got a huge amount of time, but a little introduction to the test and trial. As you know, or some of you may know, we had a test and trial on common land, and we decided that whilst that test and trial really reflected the uplands, it didn't really reflect the lowlands. So we looked at the landscape recovery test and trials and felt that the New Forest and the Malvern Hills would be a perfect place or places to explore so that we could better understand lowland commons. Now we've got our poll in, and we can see that the majority of people who've joined us tonight are farmers, which is fantastic. We've got 30% common land owners and good representation from farm advisors, common secretaries. So that's really fantastic. So I don't know if Susie can introduce me again. That's it, I'm back on screen. I will pass over now to Julia Aglionby.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I just want to say a little bit about the sort of policy, what's going on in the policy world, to give you the backdrop. Some of this you may well know already, so please, you may be able to put some of your interests about the policy stuff in the chat as well. So we're very keen on sharing information here. So what we're keen to do first is just to look ahead till 2025. I can see that 3 participants have raised their hands. We don't do the review or got a question, please put it in the chat, particularly if it's a technical question, or rather someone will respond on the chat, but we're not using the raise hand function at the moment. So looking ahead to 2025, 24-25, that sort of budget year, the government is there. The next election has to be by January 2025, and the budget, the 3.1 billion for the United Kingdom, is guaranteed until then. So that's the sort of time frame we're looking at the moment. So at the moment, the basic payment scheme is the main scheme. Basic payments will have declined by approximately 60% by 2025, depending on how much you get. And at the moment, in addition to basic payment, you may be in a countryside stewardship scheme, you may be in a higher level stewardship upland ULS if you're from the uplands. I know some people from Dartmoor here today, or you may be in no scheme at all. The Malverns has several countryside stewardship. It has stewardship schemes on at the moment, and the New Forest has an HLS. And just coming in is the SFI 2022. So SFI is Sustainable Farming Incentive, and you will be able to be in that if you are on CS, if you are an HLS, or if you're in no scheme, depending on your options. It does seem that there are a very limited number of CS options that are compatible with SFI. So that's something we hope the government will work on. And then over the next few years, we'll have more SFI options, both intermediate and advanced tiers, and also the local nature recovery being piloted in 2023 and coming in more in 2024. But there are lots of rollovers and extensions to existing schemes, and you may, if you're on a countryside stewardship that's expiring at the moment, you may be aware that the government are offering what's called a mirror agreement, so the same agreement you have at the moment, but for a further 5 years. This evening, we're particularly looking at the landscape recovery. So currently, there was the government have just received, I believe, 51 applications to go into landscape recovery. They're probably going to choose between 10 and 15 of those to go forward. I should say that this evening, while we're calling it landscape scale, we're not only focusing on landscape recovery. What we're interested in is delivering of public goods at a landscape scale. And don't worry too much about the name on the tin. I know there's an article in the Sunday Times and over the weekend, and lots of people talking about reductions in budgets. Please don't worry which what the name is. What we're really interested in is how we can deliver on commons at a landscape scale, and that will probably include some non-common land as well. One can look at on the surrounding commons. In terms of these budgets, the amount of money, and money is always interesting. Given maintaining thriving businesses is critical, and whether you're an individual farmer running your own business, or whether you're a conservation organisation or a public sector body, everyone needs to break even and pay themselves enough money to live. So a blog came out from Defra last year, and while it's 3.1 billion for the UK, the budget for England is about 2.1 billion per year, but a lot of that is still being spent on BPS. So the government have indicated that they expect in the next 3 years to spend 2.5 billion. So we're talking about just over 800 million pounds a year on countryside stewardship, environmental stewardship, SFI and LNR. So that's about 800 billion a year out of the 2.1 billion for England. I should stress that we are only talking about England this evening. Other nations have their own schemes. In addition to that, they're expecting to spend 600 million in the next 3 years, so roughly 200 million a year on farming grant schemes linked to productivity, transformation, adding value, innovation, research and development. And then they're expecting in the next 3 years to spend 50 million pounds, so just over so sort of 16 million pounds a year on landscape recovery schemes. So that's the sort of budget picture that the latest budget picture. I should say after the next election, that could be, could be this year, could be next year, could be 2024. I think the latest is January 25. We have absolutely no guarantee about whether there will be any budget or how big it will be. So in order to deliver on a landscape scale, as I said, we're talking about a combination of schemes that we expect to be relevant. So we have the sustainable farming incentive schemes. So there are introductory, intermediate and advanced tiers. They're meant to be very easy to get into. Whether they're easy to deliver or not will depend on your farming system and how good you are at interpreting gov.uk. So that's the sort of sustainable farming incentive schemes, and they're to work for tenants and owners, and that's more standards are being issued at the moment. I was in a meeting this afternoon about the low input grassland and low and no input grasslands, really important for lowland commons, and that's something we're very active in making the case of what's required there. In addition, there's a local nature recovery. So if you think about it in terms of current schemes, SFI is a bit like mid-tier, local nature recovery is an evolution of higher tier, and landscape recovery are new schemes. The government are talking about whether it's land use change or whether it is catchment areas or big critical areas for landscape. The other thing is that whether you have a view or not on the use of the word recovery, whether you prefer it to be enhancement or anything, if we can just accept for this evening, those are the names of the schemes. I appreciate they don't appeal to everybody, but that's where we are. So going to the middle box, the green box, the government have indicated, Defra have indicated that there will be an incentive to link together various local nature recoveries. So you might find that various commons that are next door to each other, or commons and a farm, or commons and a state, by linking together, by having linked LNR schemes, there should be an incentive for doing that. You may not wish to link, but by being adjacent, you can also deliver. It's all about connectivity across the landscape, whether that's delivering for nature, whether it's delivering for climate, whether it's delivering for water and flood management, and as well as access and our cultural and heritage. All of those benefit by having these large scale blocks of land. So in terms of what you can do now, we appreciate that we're talking about the future. It seems as though the future never comes at the moment. We've been working on this stuff for the last 6 years. It's a sort of tortoise rather than a hare race, but do think about what you can do now. Do choose and practice with a mapping package, understand what your current assets are, what's on your land, what's on your common. Do collect baseline data from a wide range of sources. What are your land parcels? Are there any vegetation surveys? Have any bird surveys being done? Are there water levels? Do look for as much baseline data as you can. If you can get it in what's called a shape file, so a digital format, so much the better. Do make sure with regard to your common that you've got the contacts list of all the people who have common rights and the owner, any other bodies that use your common, and get those up to date. On our website, we've got a toolkit, which I'll come to in a moment, and that gives a help. So you go to your helps you how to put together your what we call a live register. You need to go to the Commons Registration Authority, which is usually your county council, to get your up-to-date register. And do take a health check of your association and the neighbouring land. How is the governance working? You know, how are the members of your association, how are they working in terms of their grazing, in terms of their farming? Is your association got the appropriate structures in terms of chairmen, secretaries, treasurers? Have you got the right bank account? Is your bank account gone dormant because you've had no money going in and out of it, which seems a common problem happening at the moment? So get yourself all prepared for when these schemes are happening. And finally, just to say, do look at our website. We have a Commons toolkit. It's just in sort of developing at the moment. We will be populating it with more and more information as we go along. So this is what it looks like when you go onto our website, and there are these 9 windows you can go through and find out more information. So that's all from me in terms of the sort of national picture. We do, as Lyndsey said, this test and trial has led on from our national test and trial, which was on Lowland and Upland Commons. And we're also due to start a new test and trial subject going through the Defra board at the end of this month, and that will be road testing SFI on moorland. So we're trying to support as many people as possible to deliver public goods from grazed common land. And thank you very much for joining in and being part of our community with regard to this. So now we're going to move on to Joe. So we're sorry, I'm meant to be introducing Joe and Sue. It says, would you like to come on? Excellent, Susan.
Hi.
So Susan, as Lyndsey had said, is our test and trials facilitator for the New Forest, and you've been working with us since about March time, Susan, haven't you?
Yeah.
We're really pleased to have you as part of our team. We'll be working for about 18 months with the Foundation for Common Land, focusing on the New Forest, but very much linking up with Joe in the Malvern. So over to you, Sue.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am the facilitator for the New Forest area, so I work alongside Joe, who's working in the Malverns. And the first thing that we're going to do, because everyone's coming from a very wide geographical area this evening, is we're going to give you a very brief introduction to the 2 areas of study that we're looking at in this test and trial. I think just briefly, just to mention, it's a 3-phase trial, and this evening we're just reporting back on the first phase of the trial, which was about asking landowners, land managers and commoners what would incentivise them to participate in a landscape recovery scheme, and looking at what sort of incentives people were looking for in terms of support and that sort of thing. So that's really what we're reporting back on this evening. And then we're going to move into phase 2, which is looking at the governance, and then phase 3 is looking at the long-term agreements, because one of the sort of distinctive features of the landscape recovery schemes is the fact that they're looking for something, you know, up to 30-year agreements. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to screen share, and just very briefly, I'm going to introduce you to the New Forest, and then Joe is going to take over from me, and he will introduce you to the Northern Hills, and then he will be chairing the little talking heads that they're having for the landscape managers as the owners as we're looking at this evening. So hopefully I'll screen share and this will work. So hopefully everyone can see that. This is really sort of multiple outcomes at the landscape scale. What have we found out so far? But this is really the introduction. So the New Forest, as you can see, is a very large area. We're located down in southern England, and we are an area that sits, well, we have Salisbury up in the north, and we have a large conurbation of Bournemouth and Poole here, and we have Southampton over here, and that follows along into along the Solent towards Portsmouth. So we've got a lot of population pressure on us either side. But the New Forest is 20,000 hectares, so I think that's about 374,000 football pitches, if you think in football pitches. And it's one of the largest remaining tracts of unenclosed pasture, heath and forest in southern England. It is a very sort of, it sits within the Hampshire Lake Basin. It's a low plateau that sinks gently from the northwest down to where it touches into the Solent. And it's surrounded really by chalk downlands from Dorset, Wiltshire, Hampshire, and then again onto the Isle of Wight. So that's sort of, where we are. On the surface, it's very, very sort of poor soils. It's a mix of poor soils. You've got some very sort of gravelly, sandy, poor soils. You have some richer clay loams, and then you also have some very waterlogged mires. And it's this kind of geology and overlying soils that gives the landscape the characters that it has. So here we are looking at various images of the New Forest. So underneath these soils, there's this clay bed, and it's this clay that holds in the moisture and creates these amazing lowland mires, which we have, and that are very, very characteristic of the New Forest. The distinctive vegetation, makes up the uniqueness, I think, of the New Forest. And I think if you're having a look at the picture postcards that we've got here, you can see, some very diverse landscapes. The area that we've mostly looked at is this most extensive area of heathland. It's 10,000 hectares. I think it's, sort of one of the largest, if not the largest remaining extensive area of heathland that we have. And within this heathland habitat, we have these the grasslands that we can look at. We have the heather, and we have the mires, and there's sort of quite a lot of the open grasslands here as well, and we've got heather too, and we've also got some sort of wetter soils that are going on around here. We also have some amazing areas of very, very open, clean water. We have some of the cleanest water, I believe. There are also about, I think, 1,000 ancient trees, so it's a very, very special area. And as a result, it has the highest possible conservation status, and it is legally protected. These are all things that we have to consider when we're looking to, particularly when we're moving on through the trial into the governance phases and the long-term agreements. And that is the level of protection that the New Forest has. It's a designated SSI. It has been since 1971. It's also a Ramsar site. It's a special protection area for birds, amongst many other conservation protection levels that it has. So it was designated a national park in 2005, but the Crown lands, day to day, they're managed by Forestry England. They follow the SAC plan, and they've had a successful HLS which has been rolled over, and we're going to probably look at some of the things that have benefited from that. And the other major landowners, there are several landowners, but the other major landowners we have are the National Trust and Hampshire County Council. National Trust is currently not in scheme, and Hampshire County Council has, having had a 3-year break from the HLS, has recently gone into a countryside stewardship. So amazing wildlife and flora and fauna, and this is just a tiny snapshot of the kind of things that you will find. Very, very diverse, from the heathland sort of habitats right the way down to some of the wetter environments as well. So grazing. So grazing by the commoners, and they're ponies and cattle. They really are considered to be, I think the word is, the architects of the forest, and is absolutely essential part of the management of the forest. And they help to maintain heath, bog, grassland, wood pasture, everything. They're very busy out there. Apologies to the donkey keepers and the people that keep sheep up on the common, but these are my snaps, so it's a question of what I had. But you can see that there are a sort of, these grazing animals, and we also have pigs that go out for pannage when we have good mast years. So we've got a very active livestock picture that is going on out there as well. And just to prove to people that might come from slightly more upland areas, we do occasionally have snow. So the rights of common, they are linked to land. They're not linked to a person, and they're not linked to a built property. And also, there is not a fixed number of livestock. This is something that's quite differentiates out the New Forest. And we don't have a livestock number. So currently, by the end of 2021, there were just short of 12,000 animals that were out on the forest, of which about 6,000 just under were ponies, and about 5,000 were cattle, and the rest were made up of donkeys and pigs and sheep. So I think possibly that's my end of the introduction there. The only thing I would like to point out here, just looking at this map, it is the dark olive green areas that we actually have covered in the test and trial. So we're only looking at that. The lighter green areas are the enclosures, and the blanked out bits are urban areas. But I think I'm going to stop sharing, and I think it's time to go over to Jo, who's going to introduce you to the Malvern Hills.
Hi everybody, I hope you can all hear and see me fine. So my name's Jo Leaper. Like Susan, I'm a test and trial facilitator for the Foundation for Common Land here, as Sue said earlier, here in the Malvern Hills area. So I'm doing exactly the same role that Sue is, but in the Malvern Hills. So I won't go over all that again. But I'll just give you a quick introduction to the Malverns, where they are and what it's all about here. So the Malvern Hills are located about halfway in the West Midlands, about halfway between Birmingham and Bristol. They're on the border between Herefordshire and Worcestershire. So if you look at this picture here, on the left-hand side of the picture, that's Herefordshire. On the right-hand side, that's Worcestershire. And you've got the town of Malvern down there, which goes up and over the hills, actually, through the Witch Cutting. So you have got some sort of quite urban areas really on the bottom of the hills, which makes it an interesting site. And as you can see, the hills are about 8 miles long, I think, if I remember, and they go from north to south, south to north. So in the south section of the hills, actually, there is a bit that goes into Gloucestershire as well. So the hills do actually stretch across 3 county boundaries. Most of the hills are common land, so the majority of, if you look at the line of the actual hills but popping out the landscape, most of that's common land, and most of that is owned by the Malvern Hills Trust, owned and managed by the Malvern Hills Trust, with some smaller parts being owned by private estates and the National Trust and the Wildlife Trust. So this bit we're looking at now, there are commoners with commoners' rights for all of the common land on the hills, but the bit we're looking at now is more the north end of the hills, and that's not really got any active commoners anymore. A lot of properties have been sold to people who have the rights now but are not really interested in commoning. So that's grazed by the Malvern Hills Trust through a licensee grazier on their behalf. And then you've got, like in the New Forest, you've got a number of designated sites. So you've got scheduled ancient monuments, such as this one, which is the British camp hill fort, a Bronze Age hill fort, if I'm correct. And you've also got a number of protected species, and the whole area is an area of outstanding natural beauty. So you've also got species such as skylark, great crested newt, adders, black poplars in the area, which give it designations. And you've also got triple SIs, number of triple SIs within the area. And this picture here is a picture of Castlemorton Common, and you've got that's a bit different to the rest of the hills. So you've got the main section of the hills that run from north to south, I was saying, and then just off that you do have these commons that come down on the Worcestershire side of the hills and make up a more traditional sort of flatter common. And the Castlemorton Common is the one area of common that's still actively grazed by commoners rights. Jonathan will talk to you a bit more about that later. And yeah, so that's a bit different to the rest of the hills in the Castlemorton Common. So if we're talking about Castlemorton Common, that's why it's a bit different to the rest, is because it is a more traditional sort of common. And yeah, so I think we've got to move on a bit now. So I'm going to throw it over next to Jonathan Bills from the Malvern Hills Trust and Leanne Sargent from Forestry England from the New Forest, and they're going to talk about how land managers and landowners can collaborate to achieve better outcomes on lowland commons. So they're going to give us some examples of what they've done in the past and what they think could be done better. So Jonathan's going to give us a example first, or are you going first? Is Lan going first? I think, Jonathan, if you go first, and then we can do your bit, and then we'll come back to Leanne after that, if that's all right.
Okay, fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you fine. Yeah. Excellent.
Thanks, Joe. So just a bit of background. So I'm Conservation Manager for the Malvern Hills Trust. We are a statutory body and a charity with 3,000 acres of the Malvern Hills under our jurisdiction. 90% of that is lowland common with multiple stakeholders involved. We currently have 5 live stewardship agreements and about 20 years of experience with stewardship agreements on this site. So the question is about collaboration. So collaboration's been key in all of our work, especially the stewardship agreements. And a good example is Castlemorton Common that Joe just mentioned there. It's 275 hectares of lowland common, and the number of graziers there has been in decline for quite some time, and it's through an HLS scheme that we have managed to keep the grazing going on that site. It is a difficult site. It's not an easy site to look after. It's not secure, so the livestock can wander off the site and down the roads. So it's a difficult site to be grazed, but it has been over the last hundreds of years, but about 12 years under stewardship, to the benefit of access, landscape, biodiversity, and all those other outcomes we're after. That said, it certainly hasn't been easy. And I've had to think back through the years and tried to pull out a few key things relevant to this question. And yeah, it's not to say we've done everything right. They're just things that I can pull out now. So number one would be being clear and sharing your purpose or objectives or duty or the rights that you have. That sounds really easy, but especially on commons, it can be really complex. How Estovers works, or our own organisation, how that works, and the fact that we have 4 acts of parliament that govern exactly how we can work. It's a complex message to try and get over. 2, there's understanding that sometimes there isn't that level of flexibility that you might like. It can come across that a stakeholder is being difficult, and it's not the case. It's that they have a fixed legal duty, or that the SSSI legislation won't allow certain activities. So a good level of understanding is absolutely key as part of that collaboration between partners. 3, I put down is to develop a shared vision for the site, and that could be in text, in numbers, in maps, or even in artwork as to how you would want the place to look. It can really help with understanding. Some people find it easier to envisage what you're trying to do in words. Others, as I say, would really benefit from a picture of what you're trying to achieve. Having got that up there as point number 3, I think it's something that stewardship hasn't done particularly well in the past. It certainly doesn't have visual images of what you're trying to achieve in your agreement. And I think that sort of shared vision could really be something that could be improved in the stewardship schemes that come up in the future. Shared responsibilities is the 4th point I made. It's very easy for one stakeholder to end up doing a lot of the tasks and taking on a lot of the responsibility. But I think it helps on lots of fronts if those tasks are deliberately shared around all of the stakeholders involved, and then they really get to value the work that's put in. 5, this is something we'd like to do very soon. It's the breakout of the place that you're in, and go and see somewhere similar but different. And I know we're very much looking forward to coming down to the New Forest to see how things are done there, and we might come back with brilliant new ideas, or we might come back thinking, oh blimey, they've got it difficult down there. I'm glad we're up in the Malverns. 6 is really the most important point I want to make, and that's all of this collaborative work needs to be supported by a local and knowledgeable officer of Defra, of Natural England, or whoever. As I say, these are complex, popular, multi-designated landscapes. There's issues that arrive all the time, and the value of having a knowledgeable local officer, you know, I can't emphasize that enough, that is something required to support this collaborative working that we're after to get those outcomes on Lowland Commons. So that's exhausted my list of points. I hope that was useful, and I hope, Leanne, that you at least agree with some of them.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think you've done a really good job of explaining some of the issues that we struggle with across the board, really, when you're trying to deliver these kind of schemes at collaborative scale. So just to step back, I'll just introduce myself and explain a little bit about what we've been doing down in the New Forest. So I'm Leanne Sargent. I'm the Senior Ecologist for Forestry England down in the South District. I help look after the New Forest and a number of sites across Hampshire, Dorset, Isle of Wight and West Sussex. And we've got a number of different projects running that we're working collaborative at landscape scale already. And so I'm hoping that I can share some of the things that have gone well there and some of the difficulties. So in the New Forest, we've had this high-level stewardship scheme, which has been running for 12 years now. We're on a rolling annual renewal, hopefully until we find a way to work on an ELMS scheme. And the HLS for us has just been for the Crown Lands, but it's a partnership scheme. So we work with the verderers of the New Forest and the New Forest National Park Authority, and also the New Forest Commoners Defence Association. And that scheme has been delivering wetland restoration, which has helped with flood alleviation, habitat restoration, water storage, floodplain connectivity. We've been working on heathland restoration post-forestry, and that's really delivering habitat restoration, We've also got a number of smaller projects. Lost Lawns is improving habitat restoration across the New Forest. And a big chunk of the high level stewardship scheme as well is also supporting commoning, and as part of the high level stewardship we've got the verdurous grazing scheme, which offers support in various different mechanisms to encourage people to remain as commoners and help make that financially viable and encourage that heritage to persist. And you know, I always think that it's been really important to highlight, as Sue did earlier, about the fact that we need those grazing animals to create those habitats across the forest, and they are really creating a wide range of different habitats, and having commoners delivering the grazing delivers it in such a way that we get a really varied ad hoc level of grazing across the forest. And so you'll have some areas that are more heavily grazed and other areas less heavily grazed, and that creates the mosaic for the species that rely on it, because you know we've got species that have become dependent on those different aspects, and so you just couldn't deliver that in any other way with a state herd or any other kind of mechanism for managing the habitat to get that variety of structure. So all of these projects have been really working in collaboration, as I say, with the partners that form part of the high level stewardship, but also with a number of other stakeholders, including the New Forest Association, the Access Forum, heritage groups, and quite a wide range of different groups that have an input into the New Forest. I'm really hoping that with the landscape recovery that that scheme will be able to look across the whole forest and make it a bit easier to work at that landscape scale. Some of the things we've had difficulties with in the New Forest is when we want to do wetland restoration, you really need to do that at catchment scale, and not being able to work across boundaries. So when we come off Crown land onto National Trust land, or even private land around the edge of the forest, you can't stop doing stream restoration at a boundary of somebody's property. So you really need to be able to work at that landscape scale. So that's been one of the difficult aspects for doing the restoration works. The other key sort of difficulty is really around setting and agreeing priorities with Natural England across the different landowners in the New Forest. And I think, you know, some of the smaller commons owners have really struggled with Natural England being quite prescriptive on how they need to manage their common, whereas on the Crown lands, because we've got that scale, we're able to explain that, you know, we can have an area that's more heavily grazed and it won't really be the end of the world because we've got plenty of other space that isn't. But that's more tricky on a smaller patch. And so I think, you know, if we were able to work with the other commons owners in getting Natural England to see that across that whole scale, across the whole of the New Forest, actually having one of the smaller commons being more heavily grazed is a benefit to certain species, and in the grand scheme it doesn't really impact the status of the forest as a whole. I think the other point for me is around the maintenance of the New Forest, because a lot of our work isn't restoration, it isn't great big projects, it's the day-to-day maintaining those habitats, because we're really lucky that we've already got excellent condition habitat, but it doesn't stay like that if you don't look after it. And whilst the grazing animals do a huge chunk of the work, they don't do everything, because you don't have enough pressure to keep on top of all the scrub and all the regen in certain areas. And so, you know, we do need money to support maintenance of habitats. It's not all about new and bigger and better. It's about protecting these priority sites that we've got. And just to touch on some of the successes, one of the things that I think has been really beneficial from project I've been working on down in Wareham for the Purbeck National Nature Reserve, we've been setting up a collaborative agreement there. And a couple of the things that have really helped us there has been looking at working together collaboratively to do heathland management. For example, when we want to do controlled burning of areas of the heath, being able to do that in partnership and having several teams of trained individuals who are working on that project across the whole landscape has been really beneficial. And also with deer management, which is another huge issue that everyone needs to focus on to protect these habitats, to sustain the right levels of pressure. You know, working collaboratively on that has been really, really important. I think those were the main points that I wanted to make. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for your insights there in the New Forest and Malvern Hills on collaborative working, achieving better outcomes. We're running a bit behind time, so I'm just going to summarise those really quickly. So what here in Malvern and in New Forest, Sue and I were asking land managers 3 main questions at this phase in the test and trial, which is what would make you want to join the landscape recovery scheme, and how would you like to see support provided from a landscape recovery scheme, and what would put you off joining a landscape recovery scheme, obviously a potential landscape recovery scheme should one come about for those areas. So we had a number of things come up when speaking to land managers, and I think Jonathan and Jan have touched on a few of those those points there, such as it's important to be, you know, in places like the New Forest, working on landscape scale can be really important to achieve better environmental outcomes. And the same can be said in the Malvern Hills as well. So when you've got an area where you've got linked habitats, or you want to do river restoration, then a landscape recovery scheme could, the incentive for joining a landscape recovery scheme could be the fact that you are working on a landscape scale and you'll be able to provide those cross-boundary benefits and environmental outcomes. So we did find that a number of land managers can see the potential of joining a landscape recovery scheme because of the fact that it could be bespoke and it could be at a landscape scale, and that it could potentially, well, they're looking at it being long-term, 30 years plus, but they also raise concerns over things such as it being long-term. And, you know, if it was going to be 30 years plus, if your land management goals change during that time period, then what, you know, is there going to be a 5-year review of the schemes and things like that, which are important to a lot of land managers. And at the end of the day, what we found was really that it came down to, you know, is a landscape recovery, if there's going to be the option to join a landscape recovery scheme for your area, is that going to be worthwhile financially and in terms of environmental outcomes? So are you going to get anything above and beyond joining a local nature recovery scheme than by joining a landscape recovery scheme? And that's a concern and a voice that many land managers said when we were speaking to them. You know, if you can roll over your CS agreement into a local nature recovery one, then how easy is it going to be to go over into a landscape recovery scheme after that? Are you going to have to do all your paperwork again? Or is there going to be a possibility to link up local nature recovery schemes under a landscape recovery scheme? And these are all things that we don't know the answer to at the moment, but are definitely good questions to take forward into the next phase of the project. And yeah, so I'll move on for those. Those are basically the main things we found from land managers when we were speaking to them in this project. And I'll hand over to Sue now, who's going to do talking heads with some of the commoners from the Malverns and the New Forest.
Hi, hello. I think we can still see Joe's screen, but I'm hoping that you can see me. Maybe when Joe stops sharing his screen, you might see me. Anyway, I will talk. I would just like to introduce the next 2 talking heads. They're both active commoners. We have Matt Gardner, who is from the Malvern Hills, and he grazes both cattle and sheep. And then from the New Forest, we have Jonathan Gorelli, who is our head adjuster, who is also a commoner as well. And the question that we are asking them is one of the questions that we asked in our workshops and also to our landowners, and that is, in brief, what incentives will encourage commoners to participate in a landscape recovery scheme. So I'm hoping that I have got both Matt and Jonathan, who I can see up there. So I'm hoping if you again, I think we're going to have it where you're going to literally chat to each other, and you're just going to talk about the experiences and things that have worked well in the forest in terms of support, and up on the hills as well, and what you would like to see, and possibly again things that possibly haven't worked for you. So I will leave you to have your discussion. So thank you very much, both Jonathan and Matt.
Oh yeah, thanks Susan. Yeah, I've just about made it here in time for this. as we all know, I'm sure Matt knows with animals, what I thought was going to be a half-hour job turned out to be a 2-hour job, and so I literally just got here by the skin of my teeth. But yeah, thank you very much. I'll just kick off, introduce myself. Yeah, Jonathan Gorelli here. I'm head adjuster of the New Forest, which just means I'm the foreman of a small team of adjusters that are employed by the verderers of the New Forest, the verderers being the statutory body. One of their tasks is to deal with the management of the livestock while they're out on the forest, out grazing, so dealing with the common as animals. And the adjusters are employed to help manage the stock there and deal with any problems that they may get into. We obviously help with making sure that all the various bylaws are adhered to help manage a communal herd. The birders have a number of bylaws there to deal with that. And we're there to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to deal with any of the emergencies and problems that the stock may get into. So we deal with road accidents, sick or injured animals, and just the general management. And of course, spend a lot of time working closely with the commoners and assisting the commoners in the general management of their stock. I'm also a commoner myself. I have kept cattle in the past, so I've not got any at the moment. My father and my brothers got cattle and ponies, and I've still got a fair herd of ponies on the forest. So very much involved in it and have been all my life. So I'll just hand over to Matt now, if Matt wants to introduce himself, I guess.
Yes, certainly. So I'm Matt Gardner. I live on the sort of edge of Castle Common. I've lived there most of my life. I'm chairman of our Commons Association. I currently run 60 suckler cows with calves on the common, and I've also got a number of sheep that I run on the nearby hills. The common's currently just literally got into a countryside stewardship scheme that started this January. Prior to that, we were in a 10-year HLS scheme. There's 6 active commoners turning out at the moment. I'm actually the only person that turns out cattle. The other commoners turn out sheep. We've got one commoner that turns out sort of 400, and then the others turn out sort of 60 to 80 ewes each. I think Jonathan Bill's touched on the sort of key thing about our common is that it's not that big, it's unfenced, and it also draws in an awful lot of visitors. So there's quite a high visitor pressure. Most of it's triple SI, or much of it is triple SI. That isn't triple SI has got a lot of the very important habitats on it. And so the sort of principal thing is that although we're running, I say to people that we've got a sort of low input herd, I run a very low input farming system in terms of actual inputs to the cattle themselves. In terms of time inputs, because of the nature of the common, it's a very big time input for actually the number of animals that are there. I think that is always a sort of key thing with Castle Morton, is that the time spent is almost disproportionate to the sort of size of the farming enterprises that are taking place on it. And so any sort of future scheme, I think, needs to be flexible and work towards keeping things viable, basically, for everybody that's there, because it's one of those places where everything is sort of on the edge of viability a lot of the time. I think that's something that's going to have to be sort of taken into account very strongly.
I think that's the same with us, Matt. I think it's very much so that commoning is, a time expensive pastime. It does take up a tremendous amount of time and effort, simply by the nature of it, that the stock are not contained in one little paddock, field or whatever. They can roam over this huge big area. So we have exactly the same issues, I think, here. Again, we have a lot of visitors to the forest. we have campsites and car parks in the forest, and obviously then we have interaction with our animals, with the people. So we have all those issues, and I think any scheme that is going to come about needs to understand, you know, the time that commoners do put in to having their animals out there. I mean, I guess the question we're asked is what would incentivize us, and if you spoke to a lot of commoners, then what they're probably going to say, the two things they'll probably say is, what have I got to do, and how much am I going to get? And that's probably that if you cut it down to real basics. But I think what would incentivize us is it needs to be a bespoke scheme for your area, and I think that probably would be the same for most common areas. Every common's slightly different, and we can't have you know, one cap doesn't fit all. So I think there needs to be a bespoke scheme for the area. It needs to be a lot of flexibility. I think the scheme needs to be really flexible so that it can respond to the needs, and those needs sometimes change as things progress. And also the flexibility is so important as well, because every commoner is slightly different. We all operate in slightly different ways, and certainly in the New Forest we've got you know, we've got hundreds of commoners. A lot of those will be just keeping a couple of ponies or a donkey or two, and then there'd be other commoners that would have turning out 100+ cattle and large herds of ponies. So it covers that whole range of people and interest. And some people are doing it very much as a hobby. Some people are farming it. And so whatever scheme you've got has got to be flexible enough to try and encompass and bring everybody with it, I think. And the other thing that from our point of view, I think, is that the HLS we've had over the last 12 years here, we had a 10-year scheme, it's been rolling on, thankfully. One of the strengths of that, I think, was the local governance. And I think it's very important to have any scheme very much governed by a panel of local people and a collaboration between people. And so including the commoners, the landowners, the statutory bodies tasked with it, with controlling the stock, etc. So you need to bring all these people on board. And I think so that to me is probably the most important thing, to have a bespoke scheme that's flexible, run here in the forest, or in your case in Malvern. So I think that's probably the things that at a real basic level. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I would absolutely sort of second a lot of that, really. I think one of the biggest things we've got, one of the bigger issues is that some of the commoners are sort of in their later years, shall we say. And so if we're talking about longer term schemes, an awful lot is going to happen over the lifetime of that scheme. People are going to retire or possibly even potentially die. And so there's going to be succession issues. There's going to be an awful lot of things that are going to go on. And so if we have things that are too set in stone, I think that people simply won't want to sign up for it, because they don't really know what problems they're potentially going to hand on to their sort of next generation. Yeah. So I think there's got to be a strong degree of flexibility in there. And also I think as the next generation, if they're to be encouraged to take it up, which we hope they will be, then obviously the financial viability has got to be there. And not just in terms of the kind of blunt, how much do we get paid, but also I think the actual payment structures and how that's delivered. So for our latest CS agreement, it started in January, and we didn't actually have a firm offer until March, but we sort of started delivering the scheme in January. The sort of claim is submitted in May, and I think I've actually got it here just out of interest. The RPA will start processing the payments in December and aim to have paid by June. So it's sort of 18 months. They're assuming that everybody can work 18 months in arrears, which I think is sort of lumping, assuming that everybody is sort of doing something that they would be doing anyway, and whether the scheme is almost a bonus. Whereas in fact, it's not a great business model to encourage people to do things in certain ways. And I think going forward, if these schemes are going to involve more parties, exactly how it's sort of worked in terms of penalties as to if a certain party doesn't deliver the scheme in the right way, how are those penalties going to be applied? I think it's going to be very, very difficult and tricky to, not impossible, I hope, but it's going to be difficult to put together a model that is going to appeal to all parties, to sort of give that degree of financial security, I think, with farming being quite an unpredictable sort of industry anyway at the best of times. I think that any sort of ELM scheme needs to be a sort of reliable thing that everybody can trust and have faith in, really going forward.
No, I agree. And with our HLS, and one of the good points of our HLS is the things, as you say, it's not just been about a direct payment to the commoners. It's lots of other things. It's finance, which benefit all commoners. You know, we've for instance, it's helped finance. We've had a program of rebuilding our pounds, the wooden corrals we use, which we have all over the forest, which every commoner can then use to catch their stock up in. It's helped finance reflective collars we put on our ponies, and we've developed them for cattle as well to try and make them more visible, to cut down on road accidents. It's helped finance the stallion scheme, which has controlled the stallions when they go out, and it's helped finance that for producing the foals, etc. So there's all these other things it's helped to finance, which is a benefit to commoning, but it's not been a direct payment to any individual commoner, but it's helped all commoners across the board. So I think it needs to encompass that as well, you know, to continue with that good work that's been done.
Definitely, and I think and if there's a sort of capital payments options, whereas currently the CS scheme, everything's sort of completed in the first 2 years and then closed. If we're going for a long time period, and what's sort of possible now in terms of delivery might not be possible in 6, 7, 8 years time. We might need different things. Things will change. That almost needs to be a sort of running thing, really, where everything has the facility to be reviewed, so that we can respond to the changing times, put in potentially different infrastructure, different funding for different things as the project progresses, to keep everything sort of ticking along, really.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. Yeah.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much, both of you. You've made some really good, important points there, and I'm hoping that I'm going to summarise those, because those are, definitely the things that came out when we were having our Commoners workshop in both up in the Malvern Hills and in the New Forest. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Jonathan and to Matt. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen again. Okay, so hopefully you can see. So this is the area of the New Forest. This is just a quick thing of sort of, the when we did our Commons workshop down in the New Forest, just showing here that you can see the sort of the wide geographical. So we felt that we were very, very represented. We asked people what their rights were. The picture came through as we would expect it to, that the majority of people have rights to turn out ponies, then followed by cattle, and then pigs. Not a large number of people actually turn out pigs anymore, but they still have the rights. And then up on the Northern Commons, the people commoners will turn sheep out there. The only interesting thing about a little bit of data here is we asked the commoners to declare whether they were in receipt of BPS or BPS and VGS or just VGS. And there's a disproportionate number of people who attended the workshop that were in the claim of BPS, and I think we feel that this represented the concerns that people have with regards to the tapering out. The New Forest is currently delinked, but the tapering out of BPS, and there seems to be a shortfall of financing coming forward. So there's some real concern amongst people due to this loss of the BPS, and we felt that was reflected by the interest that people showed in coming along to the workshop. These are the questions that we sort of asked, and this is what sort of came out from the workshops. I think Matt touched on the point that in the Malverns there's this concern over the demographic, that people are getting older, and about whether or not the younger people are thinking of taking up the commoning practice. In the New Forest, maybe some similarities, but there's a very, very, very big support for young commoners, and as you can see here, that came through very much in the workshop there, trying to think of incentives that would enable people, to take part in commoning. The biggest driver possibly in people going to an agreement was people wanting to secure tradition and the culture of commoning, and being part of a multi-agency agreement, as Jonathan has mentioned, that enables the scheme to focus on some aspects of it, to focus on this way of securing the traditions and culture around commoning. And again, as I think both Matt and Jonathan said, clear, simple, flexible agreements, problems of succession, long-term agreements, how do we work through those? And then also, and I think this goes back to what Leanne was saying as well, on a big landscape scale, you can possibly put in some mechanisms to deal with areas that might be overgrazed. You might be able to incentivise people maybe to keep their cattle in, or if you've got an area that is undergrazed and you've got a lot of regeneration going on, possibly you could incentivise people maybe to somehow, because it's very difficult because we don't have any shepherding, to actually get some more livestock on areas that might need a little bit more work on them. Index linking, I think, was another thing that came out that people were looking for, aware of the fact that inputs into farming are very, very variable and costs are going up. 30-year agreements possibly need some clauses to look at index linking them. And also, again, as Jonathan said, just reflecting this, is that people wanted it to be a very equitable scheme, that it benefits all commoners, so large commoners, small commoners, everyone can take part. Enormous amount of support for the HLS that has worked in the New Forest, and continuation of the many features of HLS that we've had. And again, reflecting what both Jonathan and Matt said, having this local board and governance. And then the management of the frustrations to commoning. So looking at sort of, infrastructure and how that could deal with the external pressures that are coming into the forest, and that kind of interaction sometimes between the public and livestock management. Yes, so it's just really sort of, this is a little bit more about the New Forest, but talking about some of the things that have come as indirect financial incentives. The sale yard down at Beaulieu Road, and Jonathan was also mentioning about the rebuilding of the pounds that we've had that's been paid for by the HLS, and this ability to manage the livestock. Sightline fencing, this might be maybe up at Castle Morton, but so to stop the animals straying onto the road at sort of pinch points. This is where the bridges are, to stop them popping out from behind the bridge. A little bit of animal welfare being looked at there. Also, another thing that did come out was drift fencing. So here, this is an area that has actually been deforested. It's going through habitat restoration onto heathland, and this drift line fencing is put in to enable commoners when they are drifting, which is this, where they're rounding up and bringing the mares and foals into these pounds. This fencing, previously the enclosure would have acted as a kind of boundary. Now, once the enclosure has been thrown open, has been deforested, and is being restored, then this kind of drift fencing is very important. And then going back to tradition, I'm sure the New Forest people on here are going, okay, let's see who we can recognise. Point to point, there's a incredibly unique thing that happens on the forest once a year, where commoners race from one point to another point. It is, I think, a fairly traditional point to point. The other points I wanted to bring out, there was one last one that has definitely come out in our findings in the New Forest, and this is this access to land, to backup land, where there's this collaboration, where there for a long time there's been holdings are rented, and what is happening is that owned, and what is the problem with the backup land at the moment is any backup land is becoming incredibly expensive. It is unaffordable by a lot of people that are involved in commoning. There's a competition to own this land because it's very attractive land. It's invariably peripheral to the forest. People like a nice cottage with a couple of acres around it. That might have traditionally been a commoner's holding. And also another problem that we are starting to identify is the taking back in hand of tenancies into the peripheral estates, as people are looking at sort of what their options are and what schemes might be, and which scheme might incentivise, be the best incentive for people to put their land. So there is a real sort of growing problem that we can see at the moment with backup land in the forest. That's definitely a problem that's come out very much. I don't know, we've probably run out of time, but it's there. I didn't know whether just to say that, you know, there are some places that, you know, no man nor machine can get to, and I don't know whether we've got time for it, and I don't know whether it's going to work. But this is really sort of, I think, sort of sums it up for the importance of grazing. So I'm hoping you can see this. I don't know whether somebody can tell me. So I don't know, I've got no indication of whether anyone can see it, but it's there. It's just a cow just moving through sort of, you know, just along the stream edge there, grazing down nicely, doing a little bit of poaching, creating the kind of habitats, niche habitats that we're looking at, but I don't know whether you can see that. So I'm going to go back to my last thing and just say thank you very much for listening to us this evening. I'm going to pass you back over to Lyndsey at this point, okay, and she's just going to summarise the evening, and I think there's another poll.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to all of our participants this evening. I think it's been a really fascinating insight, and I think our talking heads have summarised brilliantly the conversations that we've had with commoners and that we've had with landowners. I've highlighted just a few points that I think are really important to note for this evening. In both landscapes, there is extensive experience of collaboration and of environmental schemes. And I think it's really, really important that going forward, the experience and knowledge of those people within those landscapes is recognised and valued, and that they are listened to. I think another point to note is that these are complex, multi-designated landscapes, and the necessity for a local bespoke scheme is really, really important. I really like the idea and the point that Jonathan Bills made about the need for a shared vision, and that's something that we've heard repeatedly from commoners and from landowners, that we need to know where we're headed, and that vision needs to be shared, and the responsibility for developing the schemes and for delivering the schemes has to be shared as well. I think we have to recognise the fact that delivering at landscape scale is desirable, it's ambitious, it will deliver, but the question is it possible and to organise the governance and to bring everyone together and to make it really work? And I'm really pleased to say that the next step in our test and trial will be to look at the governance and how we structure, or potentially could structure, these schemes going forward. A really important point that's been raised in the chat, and that's been raised repeatedly in our workshops and our conversations, is this question of additionality. In landscapes that are already delivering, how do we build schemes which recognise that and help them to maintain those really high quality landscapes that they already have? I'm going to pass on now. We're going to have a look at some questions that are in the Q&A, and I'll just bring them up. Technology isn't working with me. Here we are. So I've got a few questions, and I'm hoping that Julia will be able to answer this question for me. So Andrew Rothwell has said, in the lower northwest, there is little involvement by trusts and charities with common land. It's mainly Lord of the Manor, his agent, and the farming commoners. The compilation of a bid for landscape recovery looks to be complex and potentially costly. What financial help is there in landscape recovery for resources needed to compile a bid? And can you please comment on the intentions to attract private sector finance in the medium term? So Julia, would you answer that one for me?
Well, I can do my very best. I think it's one of these questions that raises a huge number of issues. And Andrew, you've got to the crux of one of the challenges with landscape recovery. It may be why, you know, we've been saying that the landscape recovery scheme itself may not be the best option. It may be that an LNR might be the right option, depending on what's your particular circumstances. The good news is that there is development funding for landscape recovery, so that the schemes that have just applied recently, they are going for a sort of 6 to 12 month development project. Anyone who's familiar with the way the National Lottery Heritage Fund works, you often have a development phase followed by a delivery phase, and so there will be money available for that development phase. Absolutely essential. So that's good, but we know it's going to be a competitive scheme, so it's going to be and it's going to have to be innovative, and it also ties into what Lyndsey was saying about additionality and a question from Oliver as well. So what we need to think about is landscape recovery always going to be the right fit for your particular circumstance? You can deliver at landscape scale without going into a landscape recovery scheme. With regard to the intentions or the stated ambition of Defra to attract private sector finance in the medium term, this is something that's Defra become more explicit about, and it's certainly something that we're looking at with regard to the New Forest and the Malverns. It's quite interesting, particularly if a common is a SSSI and it is owned by a public body that has, if the land is owned by a public body that has obligations under the NERC Act, because under the NERC Act, some organisations have, such as local authorities and government departments and non-departmental public bodies, do have obligations anyway to get SSSIs and special areas of conservation into favourable condition. Some water companies have that as well. We are looking into this more closely. I know there are other people who've done some work on that, and we're liaising with Natural England on this. So it's something that, particularly in the case of the New Forest, which is owned by Forestry England, that's something to look at. It wouldn't apply to land, say, owned by the National Trust. It might apply to land owned by Hampshire County Council, but maybe not to the land owned by the Malvern Hills. So it really does depend on your particular circumstances. In terms of whether it's practical and feasible to get private sector finance in, this again links through to Oliver's question around natural capital baselines and the additionality. We know with regard to carbon, for instance, that's all about additionality, about sequestration. It doesn't matter how much carbon you've got in the soil. With carbon credits, people are interested in paying for what more you can sequester. So it's, if you've already got, 100 tons, and you get 110, then you've increased by 10%, you've got an extra 10 tons. But if you've already got 1,000 tons and you're not going to get any more, then you're not going to be paid for additional carbon credits. So this is really critical, and for what we want to make sure is that areas already in good condition aren't penalised through the system, and that's something Defra are aware of. But again, it might mean that in some cases local nature recovery may be more appropriate. But that's not necessary. We do know from the work on natural capital and the work done very clearly by Dieter Helm and others, that there's a depreciation of natural capital. In the same way with a building will depreciate if money will degrade if money isn't spent on it. Our natural habitats require, if we're keeping them at a particular management, that we're dependent on grazing, then if you don't do the grazing, then that particular habitat is likely to be lost. You might get a new habitat instead, but that particular habitat is likely to be lost. So investing in grazing will keep those features of interest. So that's something that's really critical to do. So sorry not to have given a very, there isn't a black and white answer to this, but in short, there is money for development of landscape recovery. With regard to additionality for maintenance, there will be money for under local nature recovery for maintenance, but it may be with landscape recovery if Natural England are if Defra are looking for change, then it may not always be the best option. But there is the opportunity to have the conversation, and commons are, you have to remember that 20% of all our SSSIs are commons. And Lowland commons are very heavily designated, have huge opportunities to deliver and to be funded for doing so.
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. There's another, we've got another question which is in the chat, which is New Forest specific, which I can attempt to answer. And it's from Tracy in Dartmoor. And she said, with regards to the New Forest pony, how does the New Forest envisage pony sales in the current cost of living crisis, as they are a major species on your common and fundamental to your landscape? I can say that the New Forest pony sales, some of you may know that there was an arson at our pony sale ring, and we haven't been able to run live sales for the last a year or so. But we're hoping in the autumn to have some sales in the sale ring again once the repair works have been completed. And we will be running an online sale this month. I think, like everyone, it's a bit of a wait and see to see what's happening with pony sale prices. Ponies have been making quite good money in the last year. Perhaps the impact of COVID and people being at home. But yes, I think on the bigger picture, commoning is fragile. There are good times and there are bad times, and we never quite know what's around the corner. And when we're thinking about long-term schemes, we have to be mindful of those changes and changes which we have no influence over. So impacts on the economy and those sorts of things. So yes, going forward, as with all things commoning and animals, we'll wait and see. So I don't know if we've got any more questions in the chat. I will just.
I could look at the one about the multidimensional definition of biodiversity if people are interested in that one.
Yes, could you do that, Julia?
Yeah, absolutely. So Giles, thanks very much. I've answered one of your questions online, but in terms of the Convention on Biological Diversity, for those who don't know, in the same way that we have the COP meetings, the Convention of Parties around climate, there are also similar meetings that are organised by the UN around biodiversity. And in terms of the Aichi meeting, so these were targets put forward for how should we address biodiversity internationally, and really trying to mainstream biodiversity into the world, into the economy, so that we're looking at sort of what you might call an environmental economics perspective. What we know is that the market for most goods and services doesn't include environmental aspects, and those are public goods, which that's what governments are paying for. We do feel, when we look at biodiversity across Britain and across England, I should say in this particular context, that it is critical that we look at the societal benefits of biodiversity. So it's nature for nature's sake is absolutely great, but also we need to understand, and the work of Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge is very much reminding us around this, that biodiversity is the foundation of a lot of our economy, and if we allow biodiversity to diminish to such a level as a tipping point, there will be serious implications. So it's looking at that societal benefits, and we are very much minded looking to mainstream that. The economists call this internalizing the externalities. So at the moment, biodiversity and other goods and services are external to the mainstream economy. Martin Harper from the RSPB summed it up very well by saying, we buy food and we buy computers and we buy things like that. We buy timber, we buy all of that in there's stuff we pay cash for at the till. What we forget is that there are so many other things we don't pay cash at the till for, but we still depend on clean air, clean water, and that looking after biodiversity helps us keep those aspects. So it is integrated, though what often happens is when you get down to the detail and the discussions, the legal aspects such as SSSI designation tend to sort of rise to the fore, and we we often find that an integrated approach isn't taken because of the statutory primacy of SSSI designation. And that's an area that we continue to work on with Natural England, particularly with commons, which deliver so many multiple benefits. And it might be the features of interest, the biodiversity features of interest at the time of designation of the SSSI may not be, there may be alternative, and some people would say better features of interest that we could develop by looking at having a more diverse and more vibrant environment. It sometimes sets things in aspect. The particular SSSI designations doesn't mean they're bad. It just means we can do things differently and deliver more for society overall. So that's the sort of integrated approach that landscape recovery is very much trying to take. And we hope that by looking at this, we'll be able to look holistically across what biodiversity and other environmental goods and services bring to the New Forest and the Malverns, and how people enjoy them. The public engagement, both these sites are so heavily used. What is the mental and physical health and well-being that as society we are getting from having a rich and diverse nature? I think that's
Thank you so much, Julia. I think we're very close to 9 o'clock, which is when we're meant to be finishing. I'm just going to ask Susie if she would mind running our last poll. And while you're tapping away, I'll just wrap up this evening. So if Susie, if you wouldn't mind popping the poll up, I'd like to say a massive thank you to everyone who has contributed this evening, but also to those of you who've joined our webinar this evening. Going forward, the next phase of this test and trial will be answering the question for Defra, which is how to construct agreements for different land ownership structures, for example, individual and group agreements, tenants and commons. So we'll be running further workshops in the Malvern Hills and in the New Forest, and we'll be updating you on the findings of that phase in future webinars. So we'll send that information out to you closer to the time. I've popped my email address into the chat. If you would like to contact anyone, feel free to send me an email and I can pass on your comments and your messages. And likewise, if there's anything you'd like to share with us or talk to us about, please feel free to email us. We have lots of information available on our website, which is really, really worth going to. So it's at foundationforcommonland.org.uk. That's a really useful site for commons associations, for commoners, and our toolkit, which is growing slowly, will be really useful for all commons going forward when they start to think about which ELM scheme will work for them. I think that's everything. So we've got nearly everyone, and we've got our results. So interesting. Which do you think would work better for Lowland Commons? And the majority have said there's not enough information available to know currently. And I think that's a really big problem with the way that the schemes are being developed at the moment, is that we simply don't know. Equal amounts roughly think that a linked local nature recovery scheme and a local nature recovery scheme will be good for Lowland Commons. And interestingly, only 5% thought landscape recovery would work. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we'll see you again.